This story, because Sunday, do you know what day Sunday is? Sunday is Mother's Day, a day that you get to say, I love you, Mommy, and to do nice things for your mommy. And all your mommies out there, I hope your kids will be doing something nice for you this coming Sunday. And this story is about a nice thing that this girl does for a next door neighbor. She does it, her mommy is in the story, but she's really doing something nice for her next door neighbor. It's a hat for Mrs. Goldman. It's a great story. A hat for Mrs. Goldman. So this takes place in the wintertime, and it actually might snow tonight or tomorrow. So it would be appropriate to read this story today too. So, when Sophia was a tiny baby, I have to, let's get situated here so you can see the picture. When Sophia was a tiny baby, Mrs. Goldman next door knit her a tiny baby hat to keep her warm. See this beautiful hat here? A beautiful hat with a pom-pom on top to keep her head nice and warm. Now Sophia is big. See, she grew up. And she makes the pom-poms for Mrs. Goldman's hats. Mrs. Goldman is her next door neighbor. Hats for the tiniest babies, hats for small, medium, and large heads. Mrs. Goldman taught her how to make these pom-poms. Keeping kepi is a Yiddish word to say head, keeping kepis warm is our mitzvah, says Mrs. Goldman, kissing the top of Sophia's head. See how she's kissing the top of her head here? This is your kepi, and a mitzvah is a good deed. Sophia and Mrs. Goldman bundle up to walk Mrs. Goldman's dog, Fifi. Do you see the dog here? See the dog here? And the dog is wearing a special coat. Fifi wears her dinosaur sweater. Sophia wears her fuzzy kitten hat and matching mittens. You see the little ears on top of the hat there to look like a cat? Mrs. Goldman knitted and made them all. An icy wind blows Mrs. Goldman's hair left and right. See how her hair is blowing that way. It turns her ears pink. Where's your hat? Asked Sophia. Oh, I gave my hat to somebody else who needed it, she explains. Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be cold, worries Sophia. At home, Sophia thinks and worries again. Worries and thinks. Mrs. Goldman needs a hat. Who will knit a hat for Mrs. Goldman to keep her kepi warm? Not Mrs. Goldman. She's too busy knitting hats for everybody else. Last year, Mrs. Goldman taught Sophia how to knit. You have to use, it's a special way of taking string called yarn on two sticks called needles, knitting needles, and making things like that. It's very hard to do. I only like making pom-poms, decided Sophia after a few days. See how the string kept on winding. Knitting is hard and it takes too long. Now Sophia digs out the knitting bag Mrs. Goldman gave her and the hat that they had started together. The stitches are straight and even. The soft wool smells like Mrs. Goldman's chicken soup. Sophia holds the needles and tries to remember what to do. She drops one stitch, she drops another. Still, Sophia knits on. She wants to make Mrs. Goldman the most special hat in the world. And if you look very closely at this picture, you can see that her tongue is sticking out like this. I'm trying so hard to knit. It's taking a lot of effort. The next day, when Sophia and Mrs. Goldman walk Fifi, tiny fluffs of snow fall on Mrs. Goldman's head. Her ears are bright red from the cold. Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be very cold, frets Sophia. Sophia knits after breakfast. She knits after lunch. She knits after dinner. She knits even while Mama reads her a bedtime story. But Sophia doesn't knit when she's at Mrs. Goldman's house because the hat will be a surprise. All week, there's frost on the windows. One day when they're walking Fifi, Mrs. Goldman wraps Mr. Goldman's scarf around her head like she's a mummy. A fierce wind unwraps it and flings it up high. Sophia jumps and grabs the end of the scarf, and Fifi nips at the other end. Mrs. Goldman kepi must be freezing, shivers Sophia. Sophia knits and knits, faster and faster, stitch by stitch, row by row. Then Sophia sews. At last, Mrs. Goldman's hat is done as she throws the needles up in the air. I am done with the hat. The hat is lumpy and bumpy. There are holes where there shouldn't be holes. Look what she looks like with the hat on her head. Kind of scary. It looks like a monster hat, thinks Sophia. Sophia turns the hat over and around, inside out. Mrs. Goldman's hat should not be a monster hat that would scare Fifi. Sophia opens the box of hats Mrs. Goldman made her. Each one is special, but they're all too small for Sophia now, and way too small for Mrs. Goldman. Sophia looks in the hall closet. There are hats Mrs. Goldman made for Mama and Papa. She can't give her their hats. There's a scratchy old hat that her grandmother wore, worse than Mrs. Goldman's scarf. Sophia thinks about Mrs. Goldman and the hats they make together. Your pom-poms add beauty, Mrs. Goldman always told her, and that's a mitzvah too. Sophia feels her heart grow bigger and lighter. Like a balloon, she knows what to do. I'll add pom-poms to the hat. She searches her room for red yarn because Mrs. Goldman loves anything red. She gathers her scissors, her sewing needles, and her stack of index cards. Sophia gets busy, very busy. Look at all the pom-poms that Sophia makes. When Sophia's done, Mrs. Goldman's hat is the most special hat in the world. Look at all the pom-poms all around the hat. Sophia runs next door through the snow to Mrs. Goldman. Surprise! For me? Asks Mrs. Goldman. For you, answers Sophia. It's a hat, she says. Of course it's a hat, exclaims Mrs. Goldman as she hugs Sophia, and then she cries. What's wrong? Asks Sophia. Don't you like it? Why are you crying? Oh, I more than like it. I love it, said Mrs. Goldman. Gorgeous, like Mr. Goldman's rose bushes. And you know how I love his roses. Mrs. Goldman kisses Sophia on top of her kepi. I made it all by myself, Sophia tells her. Amazing. And will you look at all these pom-poms? 1, 2, 3, 4, counts Mrs. Goldman, and Sophia joins in. There are 20 pom-poms on Mrs. Goldman's hat, each one made with love. She gently puts her hat on. The next day, Sophia and Mrs. Goldman walk Fifi. Fifi wears her dinosaur sweater. Sophia wears her fuzzy kitten hat and matching mittens. Mrs. Goldman wears her Sophia hat. Her kepi is nice and toasty warm, and that's a mitzvah. Isn't that such a nice thing that Sophia did for Mrs. Goldman? Keeping her kepi nice and warm, making something from scratch, a special surprise for Mrs. Goldman. So, happy Mother's Day to the mothers out there, and I hope you do something nice and special for your mommies too. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and a fist bump to everybody. Shabbat Shalom.